Let's actually talk about home ownership.
I don't own my house and I don't invest in any property.
If you are a first-time homeowner, you are screwed.
A house is one of the dumbest, worst investments a human being could possibly make for one reason. You have to pay the house doesn't pay you.
Lately, financial experts like Morgan Housel and Ramit Sethi have been making bold claims that buying a home is actually a huge financial trap. Now, as someone who's bought dozens of homes and properties that have done really well for me over the years, this actually made me think. I've spent over 50 hours researching the latest data and perspectives on home buying from all sides so that I could share with you the real story behind owning a home. Let me show you what I found. To actually understand why people have such strong views about home ownership, I first wanted to understand what drives our desire for home ownership and maybe how has it changed over time. And as I dug into the history books, I actually found that opinions around home ownership are actually shaped by a complex mix of experience, cultural narratives, and let's not forget self-interest. So if we start with culture, in many cultures dating back well over 100 years, governments actually set out to sell us on the idea that home ownership is a way of life. In places like Australia, the UK and America, it was coined the dream. Governments actually wanted us to own homes because it stabilized the economy and it made people way more productive. It meant that people were tied down to paying a big debt so they could be relied on to stay in their jobs. And governments also liked that home ownership made us more self-sufficient because then we could even grow our own food. And they even had advertising campaigns to promote home ownership. Now, all of those things have created a strong emotional attachment to the idea of owning property. The problem with all of this, of course, is that many governments are now struggling to supply affordable housing for their populations. Beyond culture, though, owning land always equaled wealth and affluence. And that leads me to the impact of economics and wealth. So hundreds of years ago, it absolutely was a privilege of the elite to own land, and it wasn't something the average Joe could achieve. But then as the banks started to realize there was so much money to be made by lending to the masses, and the government supported this idea, the idea of home ownership became completely mainstream. So real estate has become a significant part of the economy and in recent times, one of the most powerful tools for building wealth. A lot of really average people have made significant wealth over the last 50 years through real estate. And in many countries, the family home still represents the biggest family asset. So if the governments want us to own homes and the banks want to lend us money so they can make more money, what is shaping the opinions on what we should be doing with our money? So I actually found there were 4 big drivers of people's views on what they should do with their money and whether or not they felt they should buy a home. The first one was personal experience and bias. You know, our perceptions of money are the biggest driver of what we ultimately do with it. So an example of this is if your parents spoke really openly about money and investing in certain assets, it's actually more likely that you're going to share those same views. Also, if you happen to be someone who's had a positive or a negative experience with something like real estate, you might also be influenced by this. The second key is economics. So when you were born may have a huge impact on your perceptions of stability. So for example, baby boomers generally viewed home ownership way more favorably because they were born in a time of relative stability and growth. Millennials and Gen Zs are facing different economic pressures like student debt, housing affordability, so they may have more skeptical views. And let's not forget people who share opinions based on self-interest. So people who are advocates for different asset classes will often argue against home ownership because they want you to direct your money to investments they believe in because that's how they make money. Then you've got philosophy and education. So the personal financial education that you get exposed to definitely shapes your views on debt, investment and risk management. So you might consume content and ideas from financial experts who are very aggressive, or you might consume ideas from people who are much more conservative. All of that influences our opinions on the risk-reward balance of owning a home. And finally, evolving lifestyles. The rise of remote work, city living, and changing family dynamics all affect our lifestyle preferences. So the flexibility of renting appeals to those who prioritize mobility and don't want maintenance, while other people might prefer the stability and personalization that comes with home ownership. So all of those issues means that almost everyone seems to have a super strong opinion, conflicting opinion on the matter of home ownership. So guys, all this leads me to ask the question, what is it that people actually want? Well, according to the Bankrate Financial Security Survey, 74% of Americans actually do want to own their own home. They described it as the highest indicator of economic stability and ranked it over a comfortable retirement or a successful career or even a college degree. Only 12% said they didn't want to own a home. Meanwhile, in the UK, real estate listing company Zoopla found that 58% of Brits actually do want to own their own home in the next 10 years. And in the recent McKinnon poll, 88% of millennials and 93% of Gen Zs said they wanted to own their own home. So bottom line, most people, a large majority, want to own their own homes. They argue things like mortgages are forced savings, that they don't have to worry about anyone jacking up their rent, that they're not trapped in the cycle of paying off someone else's mortgage, that it's their space, their rules, that it's a hedge against an unpredictable future, that it's likely to be a vessel for wealth building in the future. Now guys, in my own experience, buying a home really did give me back control. When, I realized that I would never be at the mercy of a landlord again, especially a crap one, I was overjoyed. I'd never have hikes in rent or, face eviction. And it stabilized my biggest item in terms of outgoings on my income. So let's actually get back to the research. What started as a simple question has ended up turning into a deep dive. I spent hours sifting through data, analysing market trends, and having real conversations with homeowners and skeptics alike. Now, the deeper I dug, the more complex the picture became. Every statistic led to a story, every story to a statistic, and somewhere in that maze, I started to see patterns that changed the mainstream narrative. But before I share what I found, let's actually see what's making so many experts advise against home ownership. Are they seeing stuff that we're missing, or is there more to the story? So the first person I want to talk about is Ramit Sethi. Now, he is a personal finance coach and author. He point blank states that home ownership is wrong.
Buying a house can be an investment, but oftentimes it's not. And there are far better, far simpler investments.
He argues that the commonly held American dream is largely a result of marketing and decades of propaganda. He argues that home prices don't always go up and that we shouldn't use leverage to increase our investment returns because, we could be putting ourselves at risk. He's also very critical of the costs of home ownership, such as maintenance and property taxes, insurances, and thinks that there's a huge opportunity loss when you own a home. Then we've got Grant Cardone. Now, he's a sales trainer and real estate investor, and he also advises against buying a house for personal use.
I treat houses like hospitals. You get in, you get out.
He believes it ties up cash that could be better utilized for better investments. Now, he advocates renting as a way more flexible and secure savvy option. Then we've got Gary Vaynerchuk. Known for his work in digital marketing, he's often expressed skepticism about the value of home ownership for young people.
It's a bad use of upfront capital, and it ties you up. Correct. And it's just not smart.
He argues that the commitment and financial resources involved could be a distraction and a hindrance to more lucrative and flexible investment opportunities. And then we've got Morgan Housel.
You're probably about to borrow a shitload of money for an investment that historically has been a very bad investment.
Now, for years, Morgan Housel has argued against home ownership, but later bought his own home as the practical realities of having children changed his perspective on renting. Now, although he still doesn't believe it was a good financial decision, he admits it was an important emotional one that brought stability and social connection. So let's actually dissect these arguments a bit further. Number one is the government brainwashing us to buy property. Look, I tend to agree that they definitely want us to own our own homes, mainly because it reduces our burden on them later. Speaking for myself, I'm probably okay with that. Second one, housing prices don't always increase. Again, I agree with that argument. Sometimes there may be periods of flatness or decline, but you can't necessarily lump all property performance indicators into one bucket. So different markets, different suburbs can have wildly different returns. The third argument blows me away. Avoid any leverage because it's an advanced strategy. I really think this is a massive generalization. To say that leverage is dangerous is really oversimplifying it. Leverage is just a tool. It can be an amplifier or it can be a noose around your neck. It's not necessarily complex, but it does require understanding and discipline. So if you borrow money on assets that are volatile like shares, then yeah, leverage is dangerous and it's wiped out many investors. But if you can use it carefully when assets are pretty dull and stable, it can totally magnify results. So avoiding leverage in all real estate investments because it's risky is basically like refusing to drive a car because there's a risk of an accident. The next argument, buy investment properties but not your own home. But hang on, doesn't this all assume that people have the expertise to become real estate investors? I would actually argue that real estate investing is a way more advanced strategy than home ownership. Next argument, don't buy a home because there are better investment opportunities out there, especially in business. Look, it's absolutely true that for many entrepreneurs, the highest return that they can earn on their money is in business. Sadly though, about 70% of all businesses will fail in the first 2 years. Many people really do advocate business as the highest ROI, return on investment, but the truth is it's not really suited to everyone. So if I was going to summarize all of these arguments, I think there are a lot of people tearing down home ownership based on opinions and their own experience. But what does the hard data and facts actually tell us? Guys, what I've actually found is going to shock you. In the US, people 55 and over represent 16.5% of America's homeless population in 2019. Older renters are a large and growing group. The number of renters over 50 is expected to grow from 16.5 million in 2018 to 21.2 by 2038. People have discovered that 67% of private renters over 55 won't actually be able to pay rent unless they get some adequate housing benefit. A lot of baby boomers are becoming homeless because of the death of a spouse or medical emergencies or soaring rents. And too many of them are frail to climb into the bunk beds in shelters. This is the fastest growing segment of the homeless population. It's called the silver tsunami. It's the same in the UK. 30% of people are now expected to rent in retirement, but in some areas rents are 130% of the retirement income. There's 1 million people on the wait list for social housing in England alone. In Australia, 1 in 7 is experiencing homelessness over 55, and 57% of the population that are on government allowances as their main source of income can barely afford to rent. Single women are also in a terrible plight. 70% of homelessness in Australia is women over 55, and that's increased by 83% in the last 3 years. This is all scary stuff, and it highlights a growing problem and one that doesn't seem to be well managed right now. The grey tsunami, affordability issues, government pensions at breaking point highlight that there is no easy solution on the horizon. So whether or not a home makes a good investment aside, it seems the least important argument. Is buying a home really more about the ultimate insurance policy? But what does this mean for the younger generation? I plugged some numbers into one of those online calculators that lets you compare renting with buying. So let's check it out. In the first scenario, I assumed you had $50,000 and you were trying to decide between investing and buying a home. You can see that I assumed you could buy a property for $500,000, that rents would increase about 3% each year and the property would appreciate at 5%, and that you were paying interest at 6%. After 30 years, we see that buying is better by over $1 million. In the second scenario, I did the same analysis but changed the growth rate from 5 to 3%. After 30 years, you are still ahead by buying, but only by about $65,000. Now, in the third scenario, this tells a different story. If we keep the same assumptions as before, but we only take a 5-year outlook, then renting looks way more lucrative. So what does all of this mean? It means that if you have a short outlook, then often renting looks better. But if you take a longer outlook, then real estate, even when it performs poorly, actually wins. So the question I set out to answer with all of this was whether it made sense to buy a home or not. Up until this point, we've established that opinions are interesting. Data indicated that homelessness amongst older people is a massive and growing problem, and numbers tell a different story in different contexts. But there is one piece of data that, in my opinion, blows everything else away, and that is that homeowners are much better off versus renters at the end of their lives. In 2019, homeowners in the US had a median net worth of $255,000, while renters were just worth $6,300. That's a 40 times difference between the two groups. In the UK, it was very similar. Homeowners at the end of their lives were worth £326 wealthier than renters over a 30-year period. And that's before property prices are factored in. And in Australia, ABS found that homeowners were 20 times better off than renters. Where at least one of the occupants was 65 and over, they had a median net worth of $960,000. In stark contrast, the median net worth of renters is just $40,800. So I get it. Buying a home is hard. You have to save for the deposit and costs. You have to maintain it. It might not grow in value as quickly as you would like, and you could put that money towards other faster growing investments. But does it make sense? The data and financials say a resounding yes. But more importantly, the data shows profound suffering amongst people who, at the end of their lives, choose not to buy and are now at the mercy of the government support and generosity of family. To say don't buy a home just because other investments make more sense is a soundbite that isn't based on any facts. That's playing the short game. But at a deeper level, it's a yes because it's the ultimate insurance policy. Insurance against future uncertainties, against future bad luck and losses. By having a safety net, it means that no matter how life turns out, if you always have a way to put a roof over your head, you can still live a life you love. You can see this as a complex issue with convincing arguments both sides. While the maths shows that renting is better in the short term, long-term statistics reveal a different picture and home ownership is significantly better. My goal here was not to persuade you one way or the other, but to present the facts so that you can make an informed decision. Home ownership carries major financial and lifestyle implications, as does renting indefinitely. You need to weigh up the pros and cons and determine what aligns best with your own circumstances. Now guys, if you found this video insightful, give it a thumbs up and please subscribe more for deep dives into financial myths and realities.